Good morning. Welcome to our third session of Skills Sustaining Your Practice. My name is Michelle Lisa Paulson. I'm the Education and Community Engagement Manager here at Ulite Arts, and I'm so excited to have you all with me today. So this session is the third of the four for Sustaining Your Practice. And so next week, Taxes for Artists is our last session for this. But as always, we are archiving these videos, putting them on our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything or need to rewatch it, it's available for you. This session is really exciting for me because it's focused on talking about artists and essentially giving them the power to feel comfortable in the spaces where their work is being shown, commissioned, or shared in any capacity. So today I have with me Leilani Lynch and Yvette Yanez del Castillo. And I'm so excited for both of these ladies to be joining me. Yvette is the director at Emerson Dorsch, and Leilani is the chief curator at the Bass Museum. So welcome, right, chief?
Just curator.
Just curator. I still think of the chief. So welcome, ladies. Did you all want to share a little bit more before we get started?
Sure. I guess I can go. Yeah, I'm Leilani. I worked at the Bass currently as curator, although I've held a few different positions with the institution over the past 10 years. And I've also worked at Locust Projects. So yeah, happy to be here.
That's where we met, Locust Projects.
Yeah.
And Yvette?
Hi, everyone. My name is Yvette Yanez del Castillo. I am the director at Emerson Dorsch Gallery. And I've had the fortune of actually building my professional career, starting at the Moore Space in 2004, which was a nonprofit organization. Then I was appointed director of the De La Cruz Collection, where I worked with the family from 2007 to 2019. And in 2020, started with the great team at Emerson Dorsch Gallery.
And I think that shows you why these two ladies were invited to share in this conversation with me. And I'm so excited to be able to get through this. So go ahead and say hello in the chat, everyone. I'm so excited to have you all here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get started on this conversation. All right. And if you see any glitches or anything, please feel free to interrupt and let me know, as we do have one there. Because I know that Zoom is not always the most forgiving platform. So again, there we go. Okay. So the business of being shown. We did meet before this to talk through our thoughts and get some ideas out there, write some notes. And I try to do that always because I don't want to ever have someone jump in on a conversation and just like not have any kind of goals. And the goals for this conversation is to really empower artists to feel safe with asking for what they need and understanding what the process should look like for, any instance where your work is being shown in a public space or commissioned. So my first, I guess, starting this off is this question: after an opportunity is presented to an artist, what is the best first step? And either of you can go ahead and start.
So I think it depends on how the opportunity presents itself. Most artists are either going to be approached for an institution exhibition, whether it's a solo or group show. They may be approached by a gallery for representation, or they may be asked to submit a proposal for any of the public art programs that we have in South Florida. And I think once they define their role with this opportunity, the first thing is to have an agreement drafted to kind of let all the players involved know what the parameters are, what the budget is, what the dates of execution are for the projects, and just going from concept to realizing the project for the institution and for the community is really important. It kind of sets the precedent of how they're going to proceed with the project.
Mm-hmm. And also, like, this is the moment to, like that was saying, really define, like, is this an invitation to show my work of something that I already made? Is this a new commission? Is this a one night only performance or exhibition, or is it 6 months? You know, what is the kind of, how can we hone in on what this thing is so that you can start to understand and ask the right questions based on that?
Yeah. So, and that, I guess for understanding's sake, it really means like helping to define what the project is, but also clarifying like what each person's role is in that project. And project I use is like a very general term because it's like, it could be a performance, it could be a commission, it could be an exhibition. I think project encompasses all of those because everyone's work looks different. My work and my process doesn't look the same as, say, a performance artist, you know? And so these are kind of like the defining terms that we've used. And so a gallerist, you know, and it may feel like we're like minimizing like these topics because they're so much more complicated, but this is kind of a general way we went on to describe each one. So a gallerist is responsible for exhibiting and promoting an artist's work in order to attract buyers. A museum is usually an exhibition space with opportunities for acquisition and or commissions to their programming, as well as borrowing or showing existing works. And a collector is a person who purchases your work either directly through you or through your gallery. And I guess at this point, it's like trying to understand how it's different sometimes, I guess, for each artist. But for the most part, I guess, how would you all see each of these instances as different, and how, if someone's looking at an opportunity, what would, say, that museum opportunity, how would that look different from, say, the gallery opportunity or the collector opportunity?
So I think also, you know, within those roles, you have the artists that are not represented by a gallery. You know, we have a really great culture in South Florida, especially with the support system for artists via grants, you know, opportunities through nonprofits or exhibitions in museums, that a lot of the artists also may not have representation. And in a sense, I think understanding the roles of the network that kind of creates and moves the art scene is really important, even if you're, you know, self-represented. It just helps you kind of secure your place in the project. And of course, if you are working with a gallery, then the gallery becomes your partner in anything that has to do with the project. What's interesting is that within these roles that we're defining, whether it's an independent artist or gallerist, museum or collector, if you think about it, it's all intertwined, because the artist is at the core of any of these players realizing their projects, but the artist is really the one that's making that vehicle to support the creative powers of these institutions. So I think it's important for the artists to understand their power in any of these instances as well. And the fact that, you know, you have the gallerist who represents the artist, you have the museum that exhibits the work, and then you have the collector who is the supporter of the artist, and at times the gallery and the museums. So it's important to understand how everybody's connected in the process.
Right. Yeah, and I think in Miami, there are also like hybrid versions of these roles, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are collectors who have museums, there are galleries that also kind of run more like experimental curatorial project. And so I think it can sometimes be confusing, but, you know, I think with these sort of 3 breakdowns, you have at least an idea. And, you know, I like to think about, you know, as a museum worker, we get to have this sort of like rather short in the scheme of things, but intense relationship with an artist, you know, that is working towards an exhibition or sort of final production of some kind. But then, you know, you have the gallerist who is kind of this long-term support. And then the collector also kind of participates in that way as well. But so we all have these different defined relationships with artists.
Yeah, I think that's really important also to acknowledge, is that with it's also, defining the roles of each thing also helps you to understand which direction you want to go in. Not every artist wants to be a museum artist. Not every artist wants to be or needs to be like represented by a gallery. And I think that is it's hard to kind of reconcile with that, because I think that in every instance, career has like this kind of like track, right? Like I do this and then I do this and I do this and then I do that. Whereas with art, it's way more nebulous. You might go in a completely like the opposite direction from that, or you might not go in that route at all. But understanding if you need a gallerist, it's a bit, obviously it's difficult, but not everyone needs to have a gallery to push their work. And I think that with museums, it's like this kind of in between, right? Where you kind of get that like support in the moment, but you also don't feel, I guess, committed to that space also. But then you also can end up in a situation where a collector is like your lead support for like 10 years, because they're like constantly, they're so supportive of your work, and they're just like pumping more support and financial support into your work. So that is like it's very nebulous. And I think Miami has taught me that all of these things could be completely shifted at one second, or like can be completely different at any moment, basically.
Yeah, and also to say that, you know, all of these kind of institutions, I guess a collector is usually an individual or a group of people, but, you know, as kind of art workers, we move between these spaces too. So even though as a museum, you know, you might encounter me as a curator, perhaps like Michelle and I, like we met when I was working at Locust Projects. And so what does it mean when you also cultivate a relationship with a arts worker who kind of can move between these different spaces, like you bet as well throughout your career, and you're able to support artists in that way as well.
Right. Yeah. And you kind of, I mean, again, it's like you can go from like visitor services to like the artist in the show, you know?
Yeah.
Like I did visitor services at ICA years ago, and now they own my work, which feels kind of like a younger version of me would not understand like how that transition ever happened. And I still don't really know, like one day it just happened, you know? So it's definitely a thing. There was a conversation we were having earlier today about contracts that I think this might be a nice time to talk about, but well, maybe we can go to it next actually. So one more, I got kind of excited. So this is really more so just like, I don't even know if we really like go too long into this one, but this is more so just like defining like the two different kinds of like, just like base level, like more tax centered, I guess, or like more business centered language, but the nonprofit art space versus the for-profit art space. Your work or your process within those two will probably look a little bit different because their roles are different, right? Nonprofit art spaces typically are commissioning or exhibiting work, but are usually not pushing the sales of that work. And I think a big example for that in our city is Locust Projects, where they're typically quite monumental works that an artist wouldn't typically either won't sell because it's so gigantic and crazy, or it's ephemeral and it's paint and bits and pieces of things that fall apart if you take it apart and can't be put back together. And then whereas for profit, it's more of like business and transactional and meant to foster like the sales of the artist's work, right? And I think what I'm trying to, I guess, say is that the kind of work you're going to do in these spaces can either be exactly the same because it translates for your work, or it could be completely different. And yeah, I guess if you want to expand on that a bit, because I mean, at this point, you both have experience with both things in some capacity. And I think that's like what I think people really like about collectors too, and collection spaces, is that there's the funds there to really like be very monumental and playful with what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about at the core kind of like different funding models. And so these kind of definitions also look different, let's say outside of the US. like how institutions are supported. So I guess just a small caveat, but yeah, I mean, nonprofit spaces generally are funded with various funding, but can through grants and have like kind of a mission to show. So we can't really, the sale of a work is not part of the way that the museum runs, or, you know, a place like Locust Projects as well. It's through other funding models. And then, yeah, I guess, Yvette, I'm also curious to hear, now that you're on the kind of gallery side of things, like, has your definition of what the definition we have for profit, has that changed at all, or?
Well, I think from my experience and going back to the Moore space, which was completely experimental, and it was monumental, and they were always very energized and at times complicated projects that we were pushing through with the program, with Sylvia and Rosa and Craig Robbins. It was really a learning experience for me, to understand that even if these nonprofit spaces act more as an academic avenue for artists to produce work that they otherwise wouldn't have the support and funding, it's interesting to see now, working at a gallery, how no matter where the artists place themselves, meaning their work, in the end, this is at every step of the way, whether it's nonprofit or commercial gallery, maybe a consignment for a group show, all of these do in the end act as a vehicle of economy. So it's not said, you know, it's not put in writing, and it's not really something that's discussed, but I think what's important for the artist is that the moment that they have an opportunity, that opportunity presents itself to bring awareness to their work and to their practice. So I think that has to be really important, no matter where your sort of, you know, ideas end up, in what model, is just knowing that that is a place where you're gonna bring people's attention to your work, and it opens up more opportunities. And in building these networks, whether it's profit or nonprofit, being really aware of the differences can present really great opportunities for artists and for the institutions.
Yeah. So, oh. I clicked once and it went all the way to the end. So this is something that Yvette also has already said here, but I wanted to really highlight that the artist is at the center of all of this. You're not stuck in a silo. And at the end of the day, right, every single opportunity that's being presented to you is being presented to you for a reason. They reached out to you because you're the artist, you're the person who they found on Instagram or somebody recommended to them. And so no matter what role you end up in, or whatever space you end up in, they asked you for a reason, and you're not, you know, you're not stuck in this space where you have to do everything by yourself, or you have to just figure it out by yourself. The point of having a gallery, if you have one, is to be able to, like, you know, like, I forward all the random inquiries I get to Anthony, who is my gallerist. He reads through them. He tells me if he's ever heard of the thing or whatever, especially back in the very beginning of my practice, when I started getting those weird emails that are like, my wife, it's my anniversary and my wife wants one of your pieces. You know those?
Last night.
Are those scams?
I get them all the time and I giggle. I'm like, it's my wife's anniversary and I'm out at sea. It's like, really? Okay.
I can only buy this if you'll take a check.
Right.
Exactly.
Cool.
Or do you have anything that ranges from $500 to $2,000? I'm like, that's a big range. Like, it's a very big range. Right. But, you know, in the beginning, when I first got that, he was like, yeah, this is a common scam. Don't worry about it. Like, just let it go. I was like, okay, cool. You know, but I think that as artists, we're constantly thinking that, like, we just have to, like, make it work by ourselves, like, no matter what, like, even if there's some complicated issue going on. When the museum is there, you can ask questions. Like, if you're, like, doing a museum show, like, ask all the questions, right? Check in as often as possible. And the same thing with in any instance, if you're talking to a collector, if, like, someone's asking about the cost of purchasing your work, there are people you can reach out to ask about like, am I pricing well? Like, even if you don't have any of this representation yet. And I just really wanted to highlight that conversation too.
Yeah, and go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Just that also, I think in our, like, as we were prepping for this talk, I think this also came up in terms of, as you kind of get into the early conversations of, okay, now I might have a show, I've been invited to do something. And there's these moments where you might feel kind of taboo asking, okay, so, what is the budget? Or do you have, like, what are the parameters? And I think we wanted to say this because it isn't like an us versus them scenario. It's all, at the end of the day, like you said, Michelle, we approach the artist to do something together. And that means we have like a commitment to doing that. And so, yeah, we might not, like, there might be compromises along the way, but I think at the end of the day, knowing that you kind of are at the center of this, so we want to find a solution either way, can help just push through asking questions that might feel a little awkward or taboo.
Yeah.
Now, for the artists that that are represented, I think having that sort of dual commitment to the gallery, as the gallery has for them, like Michelle said, to kick off the talk, you have a great resource with your gallery, not only in understanding and defining whatever terms are associated with the project, but also being another partner in finding resources. Maybe there is a limitation for the budget, and you're thinking of a greater installation, and really the gallery can help sort through that with the institution, with the collector base. There's so many layers in creating projects, whether you're just going to participate by submitting one piece for a group show, or you're doing a full-scale public art project. There's so many levels of understanding the process, with everybody installed, all the players going back to the gallery, the institution, and the collector, that it's really important for artists to use their gallery and their representation, and supporting them every step of the way.
Yeah. And if you're somebody without a gallery, you have friends, you have people in the community who can also answer these questions for you, or help you to better. I think that it's like this, there's a fear in getting a no if you ask too much questions, or if you are asking for too much in general. But I think in most instances, I have never, from being on the inside, on the administrative side of things, there's never been a point where I'm like looking, or like never been in a space where it's like we're looking to be able to say no to an artist. Like, that's not what we're trying to do ever. And I think that's where it goes back to this like vague idea of like the us versus them that exists. And I think it's deeply a part of like the culture that we're in. Capitalism creates this kind of deep separation between like worker and boss. And I think the unfortunate thing is most artists have kind of placed themselves in the box of, I am the worker, they are my boss, when it's really that everybody is collaborating together to execute the project. And so, I mean, if that's like one thing that like really I had to learn, like that was like a big thing that I had to learn. And I think I was lucky to be able to come up in my practice with people like, I met Leilani and Yvette quite a long time ago, very early in my career, and having access to, people like that, like you two, and like Nina Johnson, and Anthony, and these people who are like willing to be very honest with me about like needs and questions that I had, that has it's made a very big difference when I know that I feel like for the most part, most artists feel like they're kind of like out, just like standing in a field by themselves and like waiting for people to come running towards them. But yeah, like it's really a collaborative experience. The goal is to execute the project at the end of the day. And we just like, let's figure out how to do that, And if a no happens, the no happens. It's better than compromising with your work and with your own personal like space and access,
And I think also from hearing no, there's a great educational value to that. I mean, I hear no every week, just on requests that we're making on behalf of the gallery, or we want to do a group exhibition and we're hoping to work with other commercial galleries. It's something that you learn. I mean, I think I've been doing this for 17 years now, grounded in Miami. And like I said, I've had the opportunity to go from nonprofit to private collection, to commercial gallery, and really working with some of the pioneers that we have in our community. And in that time, I sort of positioned myself to, basically cater to the needs of the organization I was with, but always being open to kind of blending, the roles of those organizations. And I've learned, and I'm still learning every day. So it's not, just the artist. I think having an open line of communication can really, alleviate some of the concerns and some of the fears that artists and their galleries have about certain projects or about certain relationships. So really, in the end, that idea of the worker, I think it affects all of us in a way, whether it's a commercial gallery or the artist. It's something that I think we're all afraid of hearing no, but it's you find a way to resolve it or move past it, and it's still a learning experience. I still, try to connect as much as possible with the artists that I'm working with, and also with the institutions that they're communicating with. It just makes the process easier. I think having a clear line of communication is really important for artists.
Yeah. And I think I'll say from my side, I actually had, like, when you were defining that kind of paradigm of worker versus boss, Michelle, like I had to kind of understand the power of the institution that I sort of held as I was representing one, because as a person, like personally, I would always be worried that the artist would say, no, I need to have this, or like, this is, how are they going to react when I say I can't do exactly what they asked for? Perhaps that's just like my personality or where I come from. But I had to understand, like, no, actually, the museum or the space might have limitations, and that's just sort of normal. Like, we all have the boundaries of how far we can go, or whatever, and that's where we tap into the rest of the ecosystem. And like we were talking about earlier, maybe you ask if they have a gallery, or if they have collectors, or can we apply for another grant. But it definitely took some learning curve, like from the arts administration side too, to say, okay, it's all right to be able to say no, because sometimes that just helps us move on to the next step, which is the solution.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. I think it's all about solution finding. And I think that is, like, if all of us just move forward with, like, what is the solution to this problem, versus like the problem is just like this big boulder in front of us, and the problem might just be money, or the problem might be the ceiling heights, whatever. But we, instead of standing in front of the boulder and being like, well, what are we going to do with it, trying to push forward and figuring out how to get it out of the way is like the main focus. And I think that it's hard. It's funny because I think on both sides we're scared of like what's gonna happen, and I've seen it happen on both. I've personally seen it happen on both sides, where as an institution, you're like, well, we only have this much, or we only have access to these things, hope they're gonna still want to do it. And then the artist, you can tell they're like, but I need this thing, and it's, instead of it being combative, it's like, so how do we fix that? Like, how do we figure out a way to make this work for everyone? And there's usually a solution. Like, there is usually one in some capacity, and sometimes that solution is just not doing the project at that time. But most of the time the solution is just shifting something about it so it fits better, or so that it can be easier to execute in that moment. And that is like, there's always an option of postponing things. There's always an option of trying something slightly different. And it's like, if you really want to do something right now, like, maybe the option is to do something different, so
I think if anything, the pandemic years, right, have taught us that we have to be fluid in the way that we sort of operate in our professional careers. So I think there's so much opportunity for reinventing the way that we approach projects, whether it's an exhibition or performance or public art project. I think we've learned a great deal on how to be fluid in our approach to whatever it is we're doing with that counterpart, right? We certainly learned a lot at the gallery. And with that, I think also the way that the Miami Museum, the institutions and the collectors, the way they turned out during the pandemic to support the artists is something that was very rewarding to see, because it really just, this idea that we're all in the same place, and that sort of lack of contact, it just kind of, I think, created so much more momentum in the way that we work together, that it's changed already the way that our city's working. I mean, we're sitting doing a Zoom lecture, and it's, you know, 3 years ago we wouldn't have operated that way. So yeah. Again, understanding that there are changes that happen in the evolution of the arts in South Florida for whatever reason, you know, health, economy, politics, we're still very much moving forward for that goal. So it's being able to change, just kind of make slight changes is important.
Yeah. It's actually, you know, speaking of the pandemic, a conversation I had with an artist during our relief fund period that we did in 2020 with Ulay was what kind of spawned this series. It helped me recognize that not all artists have been given the access points that maybe I have or a lot of other artists have to kind of understand all of these processes. And it completely shifted the kind of programming I was making for other artists. Because in some ways, you know, it's easy to make programming from the standpoint of like, so we all understand all of this stuff already. Let's make other programming that's more, maybe more academic leaning or more heady and more theoretical. When I was like realizing that there are artists who don't have the practical, like logistical breakdown of the career, like as an artist, like what that looks like yet. And in still understanding that this is nebulous, like everybody's career path is slightly different. I created the skills how to apply program in 2020, and then skills artist toolbox, and now sustaining your practice. And all three of those are all linked together with the hopes of everyone kind of evening that playing field, right? Where everyone has access to, at the bare minimum knowledge that they should be able to get. But you typically either get that in your university education or in your postgraduate education through the work that you do with galleries, museums, and such. But if you haven't gotten to do any of those things yet, you're still kind of like, where do I go? How do I get started? And so I do appreciate that people have been making those shifts as needed within the practice of arts administration so that artists have a better understanding of what they're doing. Yeah, and like Zoom's great. On a Saturday morning at you know, 11 a.m. there's 42 people sitting and watching us sit at a computer. And then when it's over, we can all just go to the beach or something, go have a drink, you know?
Exactly.
Whereas when they're in person, there is like this accessibility point that doesn't happen when it's in person. And if there's someone who just can't be there because they have kids or because of any other reason, they just miss that thing. Whereas with Zoom, and you can save it really easily, there's no fancy equipment. So I really appreciate like how the pandemic has created more access points for everyone. And I hope we keep like that momentum of that up as much as possible, because I know that a lot, like I'm not the only person who appreciates it. I know obviously you all too. So just, yeah, just a quick quip from there. So the next slide is might be my favorite slide, honestly, because it's like breaking down all these questions. And there's also more questions that I think you could ask, but these were some of the big ones that came up for us. So like, are there in-kind donations available? And so I'll define in-kind again, because I think this is, again, one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. Essentially, sorry, my throat's all itchy. So essentially an in-kind donation is anything that is given to a project, artist, or anyone to use that would typically have a cost. So rentals of chairs, rentals of, you know, a lift, you know, even sometimes in-kind donations can be like the purchasing of things, like somebody would have had to purchase it, but like say a plexiglass company was like, we have a bunch of extra plexiglass, just take it, you know, that is considered an in-kind donation. And the reason we include that is because if you're applying for say like a grant, or the institution you're working with is applying for a grant to do a project with you, those in-kind donations can work towards the matching of those funds, or it can clarify how much resources you already have. Who are the donors and collectors associated with the opportunity, which, you know, is a big question often. What are some other resources available to me? And that's in the instance of like museums, nonprofits, and spaces like that. And who is the point of contact for this opportunity? That's a big one. Always knowing who you're supposed to be talking to.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, I mean, the what other resources are available to me, I think is one that I've often, from the side of representing the museum, had to kind of prompt of, like, sometimes an artist, you know, might just think, okay, you've invited me to do this thing and I kind of need to show up with everything. And then, so they're like planning to use the budget to buy a projector or to buy all the supplies and to ask a friend to help them install something. And of course, you know, acknowledging that there are various levels and different types of projects that might be more, you know, a smaller versus a larger budget. But sometimes there are resources. Sometimes we might already have the ladder, or we have the projectors, or there is a wood shop that you can use, you know, kind of being able to ask about those things that aren't just, you know, kind of what is the funding available. It's like, what are the things that you already have squirreled away behind, you know, behind the scenes that I can use, because sometimes there is leftover wood, or sometimes museums have pedestals that they don't want anymore and artists can take them, you know, like there's just stuff that's amassed and tools that are also at your disposal if you need them.
I think the equipment thing is a big one. I think artists will often be like, oh, I got to use my budget to buy all these equipment. But especially if you're working for a big museum, they typically, like projectors, you probably don't have to buy projectors, but just ask, because if they if they have the projector, that's money you can use towards something else for the project, or towards paying yourself instead. If they have a budget and they've given it to you and said, you know, this is what you can do with it, asking about like those kinds of materials can be really helpful. A lot of big museums also will have like a team of fabricators, a team of art handlers, and, you know, time, like access to certain resource things for like research and things like that. And all of those are expenses that you won't have to take on yourself, but you won't know that unless you ask it. You know, the goal is to get everybody to like be transparent enough to where they don't have to ask, but sometimes you forget. And so, you know, empower yourself to feel comfortable asking, like, what else is there available for me before I break down my budget and write it all out and start buying things, which can make a huge difference. It can make the difference of thousands of dollars really in your budget.
And it's also like kind of, it takes practice to be able to communicate what you need. And I feel like that's not something that people teach you, but, you know, at a certain point in your career, especially when you're starting to do more projects, you have to be able to tell people, others, what you need in order to support what you do, because it's no longer just you doing it, which is kind of great. But then you have to kind of know how to articulate yourself in that way, but it takes practice.
And make the connections with all of the players involved. I think, you know, the relationship that ULAI and the Bass Museum via the Michael Richards Awards or the Ellie's, the way that you consider programs that are completely united in their mission, and then even benefit the galleries that are working with the artists. These systems are all connected, and being able to navigate that, you're going to get more support. And maybe it's not for plexiglass or projector. Maybe you want to develop your project further by having a publication and you know, contributing writers, which is something that I've learned from Brooke and Tyler at the gallery, that we are putting together you know, exhibitions at a commercial gallery, but academically, the way they approach their exhibitions is like nothing I've ever seen. So, you know, understanding the powers that you have behind you makes your project even better. So it may not necessarily be those physical materials that you need for your exhibition. Maybe you want to bring in more of an academic sort of component to it, and you talk to the institutions and you talk to your gallery. And I think it's just really important to see the full scope of the project, and before being bogged down with the limitations of a presented budget, is how to navigate through that and how to make even that instance of lack of funding more powerful as you start to build your project, right? A lot of institutions work with vendors for many years, and they have contracts, and that in itself is a support system where maybe you're looking for, you know, a high-end, you know, projector that may be $20,000, $30,000, but the institution could ask one of their event producers to co-sponsor the event. And to co-sponsor the exhibition. And this is something that vendors also love because it brings them awareness to their brand and their services. Mm-hmm. So really, I think it's kind of looking at everything that you need for the exhibition, and before thinking that it's money that you need. Of course it is, that's like the most important, let's not deny it. But how do you navigate away from the no, or it's not happening? You know, I think that's
yeah. It's also, you know, I think about like how the framework for like exhibitions feels kind of like specific, and like there's not a lot of places for you to go left or right. But if the shift kind of happens naturally because there's like a better opportunity to use this material or that, or to be able to reach out to orgs that can support, because there's other organizations that also can support with the museum, obviously, like we talked about with Ulite and the BAS, for example. But like, I think we've forgotten like the power, I guess, of being able to say, we're gonna credit you on everything. Like people will be like, yeah, cool. You know, like the credit is good, you know? I think the fear is that like, oh, there's no monetary exchange, but also sometimes people do just wanna give more money to nonprofit things, you know, or to like art things. And so they're down to like help support any of those things. And that can be an in-kind thing, that can be an equipment usage thing. And I think that benefit is there. And I think that most artists don't think they can ask that. I think they think that they're in this box of like, this is what they're offering me. And I think something that's not actually on the screen, but like being comfortable asking like, so what is the budget? Like straight up being like, what is the budget? And being comfortable with like, and instead of seeing the budget as a limitation, seeing it as like an opportunity to see where you can go. And that part, like I think the budget side, like once the conversations are great until we start talking about the budget, I think a lot of the time, like everyone's like excited and ready to go. And then once it's time to ask about the budget, we're both kind of like, I hope it's enough. And then the artist is like, I hope it's enough. Like we're both on either side, just like hoping it's enough money. And if it's not, making sure that the project we do fits in that budget, or that we are able to ask about enough of these resources that we can make it fit in the budget. And I think that one of the things that happens is I say that like, sometimes I can say as an artist, I spend the money before it's in my bank account. Like, I'm like, oh, what can I do with this? And trying not to do this thing where we've like kind of put the horse before the cart and kind of ran like so excitedly to the opportunity that if it doesn't make sense in the same way, or if it doesn't work out, that it feels like something's being taken away from you. And you don't want to really put yourself in that situation by like getting so excited. Sometimes I have to treat an opportunity like it's not happening at all until a contract is signed, which actually goes back to like before, obviously we started the conversation, we were talking about contracts. And I think it was about who asked like, do artists actually read them? And I personally read them, but this is like, I think the point to acknowledge like, yes, you should read your contract as thoroughly as possible, because it creates a framework for the opportunity, right? It'll either, in some ways it'll have the timelines of the project, like the expected execution date, the start date of the contract. It'll have it'll typically kind of outline the roles of either person for that opportunity. So like who is, who the point of contact is, who is there to answer your questions, of course, but what the museum is responsible for, what the artist is responsible for, or like whatever the institution is, payment schedules, like all of that information will be in the contract. So reading through the contract and understanding and asking questions before you sign. You can ask questions before you sign too. You can get clarification. You can add things there too. Because on either side, everyone wants the project to happen. Mm-hmm. So the goal is to ensure that it happens and not to like deter you from asking any questions or, checking in on anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think contracts, as kind of boring as they are, they also just help things outside of like what you might consider to be related to the project, like how is the work getting to the museum, or what happens if something breaks, or like are we going to have documentation, or do I need to be responsible for photographing, or like what kinds of other things are related to making the show happen. And somebody mentioned insurance in the chat just now, which is so true. I mean, sometimes that's part of kind of the growing learning curve of working with maybe a museum. There's a little bit more, not bureaucracy necessarily, but there are more protections we have to take because we have a responsibility as an accredited institution that we have to do things like ask you what the value of the work is. And we have to give you a formal loan agreement, even though it might feel very strange because, let's say you and I, Michelle, are just kind of also friends, but you're an artist, but it is entering into a different kind of relationship. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you kind of go into something officially, even if it is somebody who you've known for a long time, still ask for those kind of terms.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that even with some of my closest friends, we make contracts for things. It just helps to feel like, I think personally helps to feel like your friend is going to take you seriously if something does happen, but also just ensuring that everybody knows what's expected of them. Some of my closest friends have done like assistant work for me, and I make a contract and have them do a timesheet, help me so that we don't ever feel like anyone's being taken advantage of, or like not really understanding what is expected of them, or not really understanding like why something is the way that it is. And it also just prepares you for when you do deal with like bigger institutions. Before we were talking a bit about art in public places, and if we're talking about like contracts, art in public places is like, basically a mortgage like level contract with breakdowns of insurance liabilities, the payment structure, which is like broken in like a billion pieces. Then like the breakdown of how things have to be documented once you're finally done, the expected timeline. I mean, art in public places contract, I in the way that I use a contract always kind of like for timelines, but the art in public places one is so detailed that you don't really have any questions. Like you just look at the contract and most of it is there. There might be technical logistical questions on like a personal way, but for the most part, the contract has everything. And that really can alleviate a little bit of stress in some ways. I mean, art in public places is still a big process, but having a contract when it's a process that includes like, I think in the process for my projects that took 3 years, I talked to like 10 or 15 different people, And so like knowing who each person is, knowing why they're asking me questions, why they're emailing me is all in the contract. Like there's a person who does this, and there's a person who does that. This person's going to help you finish everything. This person's going to help you to do all your final documentation. All of that information is really, really helpful with getting from point A to point Z.
And the language in the contracts, whether it's a 3-page or an 18-page contract, sometimes it's written in legal terms because that's the way that the system works. But I think taking the time to sort of dissect each one of those terms is really important, not only in the way that you set out to achieve the project, but also where you can find sort of resources if something is lacking. But, contracts are also really helpful for artists in defining very simple measures used to realize the project, like when are we going to pick up the work? How is the work going to be shipped? And I see that Emmanuel asked that question. Like, these are really important elements when you're putting together a project, because when the work is going to be shipped, maybe in the contract it tells you the work will be picked up X days before the exhibition. Maybe they're not telling you how is the work supposed to be packed. What kind of shipping services are you using? You know, are you using a third-party freight forward? Are you using art handlers? Or am I supposed to put my work in a FedEx tube and send it to you? These things are so important, because whether everybody's insured and everybody's covered, I think that it's really important for artists to protect their work first and foremost, right? So in having, whether you're independently representing yourself or you have a gallery, understanding those parameters just really make sure that your work is safe. Insurance values is something that Emmanuel asked, and it's a question to people. What in fact is the insurance value? There is, you do have a market, and I think after having a certain history of showing your work and selling your work, if you're self-represented, you have to realize that there is a market that fluctuates, and that the artist's works begins to gain more value as they show more, as they're collected extensively. So these are measures that you have to put in place before you sign away on a contract, because maybe the value of a work is not the same today that it was 3 years ago, for many reasons. So understanding that is really important. I think, again, going back to artists that are represented by galleries, working hand in hand with your gallery can certainly alleviate a lot of these, you know, complications, and just let you be an artist. And I think that's important.
Yeah. I think that the like system of like feeling like your every aspect of it gets alleviated a lot when you have like a representative who's going to handle like certain conversations for you, and kind of let you kind of run wild and free in that way. Like, they'll read the contracts to let you know if anything's weird in the contracts or anything like that, without you having to do all of it on your own. Making sure the galleries are credited for photos. Yeah, I mean, that's also a big thing. Like, make sure that there's credit in all your images. I try my best on my website and everything to like have like a caption that includes like where it was taken, who took it, if I have access to that information, and things like that too. And there is something, I'm going to put this in the chat. I really want to encourage people to test it, because there's this, like, I met a tech guy recently who, through my boss, Esther Park, who is working on a website called Layman Law that can help you to extract certain legal sentences and translate them. It's in beta, but it is really cool. And he showed me like all his lawyer friends that were texting him and telling him how great it works. And I thought that was really lovely. It's still a trial, but it could be an interesting resource to test out. And I would love to see if artists are able to see it and test it out and see if it works for them. Because, you know, that'll help. I think everything way that we can empower artists to feel like they can answer questions themselves is really important. And so, yeah, I think that
he is realizing that none of us know everything about how this sort of system works, you know? It's how do I find that information that's going to help me make this process enjoyable? There's a really good art law book. It comes in 2 volumes. It's something that I kind of live by. It's 2-volume publication, and it defines and it breaks down the law of art. It tells you about the contracts, copyrights. I mean, it's 2 fantastic books that can help artists define those terms that are written in legal, you know, jargon. And it's intimidating to see an 18-page contract that's sort of like a riddle. So you know, looking at websites that help you define these terms, and maybe finding some books that have been published to help you define these terms, it just makes you a wiser person as you approach these projects.
For sure. Yeah. So I think this is a good time to go ahead and let's stop share and answer some questions that we got. Oh, somebody asked what is the name of the art law books?
I can put that into the chat. Is there a way that we can put it into the chat after? I mean, it's just called the art law book. Actually,
oh,
here.
just the art law book.
You got it right there.
Oh, ready and available.
Amazing.
Just and this is me doing research on things. I'm like, what does that mean? So this is a really great book, and it has 2 volumes. So that's kind of what I live by whenever I get a contract.
I'll add it to the resource doc that I made also, if anybody has seen that.
And I'll type it into the chat as well.
Cool. Somebody said, what are your recommendations when dealing with handshake contracts with smaller spaces? And if you have questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A now so that we can, plan to answer it. So do either of you have a thought on handshake contracts?
I mean, I think even as something as simple as putting the conversation in email is a place to start. Because I think it's really hard when it's just a conversation, a handshake. So having, from either side, being able to sort of protect that we all remember what we talked about here is to, at the very minimum, kind of memorialize that in email. That would be my recommendation, or to ask for a contract. But if there are no models, I mean, it's always helpful, like if you have friends, or I mean, I've done this with curator colleagues where I'm like, oh, I don't have a contract for this type of work. Do you have a template? And you kind of can start to have like an arsenal of that, so that if you are on the other side of things, maybe somebody's like, oh, I don't have a contract template. And you're like, oh, actually, I do. Or at the very least, try and put an email.
Right.
Oh, you're muted, Michelle.
So in that resource doc, I also have a link to a Dropbox folder that I have, which I'll put it in the chat again, but it's a Dropbox folder that was given to me in college that has, I think, like 15 or 20 like very basic contracts that can be used for art opportunities. And I've used them from time to time. I've been lucky that in most instances where a contract was needed, they've provided it. But in cases when that doesn't happen, it is nice to do that. But I 1000% echo you in saying, like, just have a follow-up email that clarifies everything that was said. It really just makes everything easier for everyone. And it just, and tell them like, okay, so I'll follow up with you on email. I'm personally someone who I mean, if anyone who knows me knows this, like I'll always be like, can you email me about that? Because if we have a verbal conversation about it and I don't immediately write it down, or, I don't have the time to write it down yet, I might forget that. And that's just at the base level, not wanting to forget anything, but also just clarifying that like later on, we have like some kind of agreement in place already. And email is, if you were in our business of being shown, email is considered a contract as well, because there is an agreement that's being had between the two people. So we also have a question from Jen Clay. Hello, Jen. Jen is one of our residents. She says, wondering if there's a difference that y'all prefer to be approached by artists for studio visits for general feedback versus a more specific proposal. And this is, she says, is in reference to the conversation about being in the silo. And this is a big question, I think, for a lot of artists, is like wanting to meet with certain people and like not knowing how to best approach them. I know that like, the whole idea of like showing up to a gallery with a portfolio is not a thing. But like in some ways people do try to still do that. So like, what is the best way to go about getting a studio visit when wanting to talk to a specific person?
I mean, it's really important. And Jen, I totally owe you a studio visit. I know, I'm sorry. I'll make sure to do it. But I think identifying the institution or gallery or maybe, professor that you want to interact with and discuss your work is really important. I think not doing these blind, like sort of net calls for people to just come and see your work you have to be able to respect your time and the time of the other party, and just realizing and maybe learning more about that gallery or the institution, whether it's nonprofit or academic. I think just identifying those moments where there is a collision is really important, because otherwise, you know, if you're making these sort of blind calls and just sending random emails, people are just going to dismiss it, because there's at some point you're like, okay, this makes no sense, why I'm getting this. So I think identifying where you can actually benefit from meeting, or having somebody go to your studio is really important. I know as professionals in the South Florida Arts Network, we definitely make our time to go out and do studio visits. But I always like to make sure that it's beneficial for everybody involved. You don't want to just do this constant studio visit where it just turns into a blur. The whole point of it is to really make some connections that of worth, you know. So that's important, because I get a lot of emails with portfolios and let's do a studio visit. And at times I look at, you know, as much as I want to go out and see everybody's work, it's just not something that's in line with anything that we're doing at the gallery, you know? So it's important to identify the places that would work with you.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, you know, knowing that there's probably like at different junctures, different types of studio visits, like kind of what you were alluding to, Jen. You know, if the person has never been to your studio before, you probably want to do a more general like intro to your practice, or ask them like, have you seen my work before? Or like, what is your kind of awareness of my practice? And then take that as a lead, and also acknowledging the fact that when you're doing a studio visit, maybe as a curator or from a gallery or something, there isn't always a project at the end of the visit that's like promised. So sometimes it's just like an introduction, or, hey, I want to meet you and get to know more about your work because I found it interesting, but it's not necessarily like we're going to end this and I have a, you know, there's an exhibition at the end. And I think that's okay, because I think we're talking about like the sort of timelines of working with these kinds of different entities within this network, and you might be in conversation with a curator or a museum for years before you even materialize into a project. And that's just kind of the nature of how timing and the trajectory of your work goes. So that knowing that there might not be kind of like a promised endpoint, but keeping it more open-ended, just something, at least from my side, I think is important to know.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say as well, is like not having an expectation specifically of what you think should or will come out of it, but just being comfortable with getting your work shared with that person. One of the tips I was going to say is, if you are, and this is like very technical, I guess, or very specific, but if you're someone specific you'd like to meet with and you're having a hard time reaching them, check like LinkedIn or things like that and see if you have connections to that person, and see if a friend can maybe help with the introduction. I think, you know, between my 3 emails, I have just like piles of inquiries for different things. I try to get them to where they need to go, but you know, you get a lot of inquiries, right? So if you have somebody who you have a mutual connection with, that might be a little bit easier to get that conversation going. If a friend can help kind of be like, hey, I think you should meet Jen. She's been interested in talking to you about her work, or, you know, whoever. I'm talking about Jen, obviously, because she asked the question, but I think, you know, you can talk to this person, or, and also ask friends who they recommend that you speak to. And they might have, you know, connections that they think might be the best way for you to go about with that. It's like it's kind of funny because in the arts, because so much is like between, is like about relationships, and like you're doing things so much on like a direct conversation basis, it feels kind of like wrong. Like it feels like there should be like a formula, like there's a form that you put out and say, I would like to do studio visits with curators. And then like everybody reaches out who wants to talk to you, but that's just not how it works. Maybe that's something somebody should make, like some kind of script, right? Yeah. And Emma says, just establishing relationships is most important, and it is.
I think
We also have a question. Oh, sorry.
also understanding what resources we have locally. Like you have, you know, the Fountainhead has the Artist Open initiative, and that's proven to be really successful, where you can just apply and have your studio be listed. And again, it may not start off as a very, you know, strong move, but eventually there is that momentum, and it's becoming a really exciting program for a lot of artists. A lot of artists are writing to me and saying, hey, should I do this? I'm like, yeah, you should do that, because it's really picking up power. And also Art Basel does studio tours during the Art Week event. They're not, you know, they have limited capacity, but there's plenty of artists who have been part of the Art Basel tours, the collector tours, that are not represented by a major gallery or have these massive projects. I've been to a lot of studio visits of artists that, you know what, I haven't learned enough about their practice. So I think understanding what resources out there that brings that audience to you is also really important. So no doubt. And also as an artist, go out and do studio visits yourself. Like you have the Bakehouse, you have the Fountainhead residency, you have the Fountainhead studios. I mean, I think also putting yourself in the position of just having dialogue with your counterparts is so important than just having people come and critique your work. I think it's about the larger conversation that may not necessarily directly reflect on your practice, but this is a system that we're all operating in. And, you know, it's basically so incredibly fluid that understanding more about your peers in the art world is just, it builds power to what you're doing. So, you know, it's really important to also put yourself in the position of the visitor, you know? It just builds a language, a stronger language for all of us. And I think that's really important when it comes to the studio visits.
Totally.
I'm trying to, I feel like this question, I'm like having a hard. So it says, what kind of opportunities are available for 3D and art to wear artists in a gallery setting other than craft fairs? I'm assuming like you mean like clothing, jewelry, and things of that sort, if I'm reading the question correctly, and you can clarify if you'd like, Kathy, but I would say that maybe the gallery setting is not right for you. The gallery setting is for a certain kind of work. And I think that that's where understanding the roles of each space and understanding which one actually fits for you is important. And I, you know, maybe the two of you disagree, but if you're making wearables and things of that sort, galleries kind of aren't, most galleries are not, are not in the business of marketing those works. And so that in that case, that might not be right for you. But there's obviously galleries that have like a mixture. Museums do lots of artist wearables and have like shops that can sell those things and know how to market those things. But, you know, I think, again, it's like because we think there should be a formula, we think I should be in a gallery, whereas maybe a gallery isn't right for you. And it doesn't always have to be craft fairs, but it could be a museum or a space with like a shop that is focused on artists' work. You know, like we did, was a one-off, but we did the Materialize projects in the 2020 during what should have been Art Week. So that was 2 years ago. And that project, you know, I can't remember the final number, but every single artist sold something. And we ended up coming something around like $12,000 of artists' work sold. And it was starting from like things that were, we had like some zines and things for free, but we had things that were as cheap as $5 up to like one piece that was like $1,000 or something like that. But for the most part, everything was very reasonably priced. Every artist sold things. Some artists sold clothing. And there's places like Showfields, right? Showfields is all about artists made objects. So there's these alternative spaces that may not be a, you know, gallery in that way, but, you know, Showfields feels like you're walking through a museum, but you can touch and buy basically anything in the room. I think most everything is for sale, right? So it's understanding, like, again, like what is actually right for your work. And not trying to fit into a space because that's what you think is where you're supposed to be.
or how to manipulate or maybe have your work evolve where you can continue to do garment design, but at what moment can you pull from that technique and bring it into more of the white cube situation. I think, I'm learning from a lot of the artists at the gallery that are doing public art projects that maybe focus on photography, but they're doing these fantastic projects because they're really looking at their work through this kind of like magnifying glass where they can pull out one thread to make a beautiful art project, right? I think it was in 2013, maybe, I went to Documenta, and Caroline Bourgeois, the way that she executed the project for Documenta that year was that she basically created interventions into the shops, the museums. So all of these public places that are not white cube, so you would see Seth Price at the garment shop, or you would see another artist at the Natural Science Museum. So when you think about where your work, whatever practice that is, where you can kind of pull a thread and make it reinvent itself and still be yours, then you're being fluid to the way that your work is conceived and realized. I've seen some really fantastic exhibitions, and I keep going back to the Documenta, where it's like you walk into a garment shop and you see hoodies, but they're actually done by Seth Price, and I think now with contemporary art, I think we've learned, because of social media and that Instagrammable moment, there's so many ways that your work can land in any of these opportunities. I mean, Alex Israel is a great example of that. Alex Israel is a powerful artist that knows how to place his work into any context and make it sort of like this community experience, right? I think he did something during Art Basel with Snapchat, right? Leilani, and I believe that was part of the BAS's program. So that's a really good example. And he makes sunglasses. I have some of his sunglasses. And then you have, artists that are creating, Paula Wilson, who works with us at the gallery. She does these fantastic videos, but then the video, the way that she packages it for the collector is this one-of-a-kind tote bag that she makes herself. So there is that moment for that cross, but you have to be keenly aware of it. You can't just submit work that really doesn't have anything to do with the thread of the institution you're approaching, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think, it's all about the positioning and knowing how kind of like to translate, how your practice can translate and kind of shapeshift in these varying environments in a way that's exciting and interesting. And you can kind of, push and pull on what like a shop should be, or what wearable art could be, etc.
So do you have any more questions? If you do, throw them in the chat now, because we will be ending shortly. And speaking of that, I thought of this piece that was a wearable piece. So at Elsewhere, I went there in 2018 as a resident, and there was this artist who essentially took a bunch of clothing from the institution and put them together, because they have a lot of like this vintage, like 1920s and 40s clothes there. And obviously, if anyone knows the history of like clothing back then, sizing was way smaller. People were way smaller also because of lots of reasons. And so this artist, who was a plus size person, made essentially an outfit that could be translated into, I think, up to a size like 36, but could be made to fit smaller and larger. And something like that. I mean, it stays at Elsewhere because that's how Elsewhere works, but it's really an interesting thing to see, like a wearable piece of art that is both like socially very conscious of like our lives and the spaces that we occupy, but that could easily be placed in a gallery space as a conversation around this topic. And if that artist were to expand their practice deeper into fashion design and things of that sort, it would fit perfectly in a gallery or museum space without having to kind of like try at all. And so there are ways to look at those things. But if if you're lucky enough to do an exhibition in a museum with like an amazing gift shop, you can have this work that you've made and then also have something that goes in the shop that's there forever. which I think is, if I were a wearable artist, that would be a big goal for me personally, because it is something that's just there and available for a long period as well. So I do see one more question in the chat. Okay, how do you perceive self-represented artists who have a multi-layered practice, such as wearable art, art and culture, tours, classes, paintings, and ceramic work, small works on Etsy site, who use Linktree? Perceive? I don't know. Do either of you have a thought on that?
So maybe I'm not understanding the question correctly, but I think Carol's asking what our position is on artists that have this multifaceted sort of practice and are using Etsy or Linktree as their way of promotion. I think we're living in a digital economy that absolutely presents opportunities for artists, just for, the same for makers or for therapists. I mean, we're living in such an exciting time when it comes to the way that you promote your sort of value, that so long as you're aware of the implications of representing yourself on Etsy, or Linktree. I mean, it seems from the breakdown that there's a lot happening with your practice, but there's definitely ways of continuing to do that. I mean, whether you end up working with a gallery or a museum, I think, again, being aware and being fluid in every step that you take becomes really powerful in your practice. I mean, we have Artsy. Artsy is a really great platform where artists are, selling their artwork, or you have nonprofits or experimental art spaces that are presenting their programs through Artsy. So yeah, this is something that's totally within reach, and a vehicle for self-promotion that I think there's so many opportunities. There's First Dibs, which is like the high-end Etsy, and it's more, so I think being aware of where you're positioning your work is what's going to bring that power to it, no matter what platform. I mean, you're a creator, and you do this because you treat your practice like you treat oxygen. You need to do it. So just making sure that you do it smart is really, really important.
Going back to that, I would say that like the one issue I personally have, that's just like a personal qualm that I have, is that I think Etsy takes a really large percentage of your income. And also Etsy has been caught pushing certain people to the top of their like search. And I think that and so for me, as like seeing like wanting people to have like equal opportunity, I'm just sus of Etsy, not artists who use Etsy, just the company itself. I used to be a big fan of Etsy until I started to learn more about their like politics. And so then I would seek out artists separate from the Etsy pages that they would make on a personal note. But yeah, I would say that being self-represented and having all these facets to your practice is very common. And I think that in 2022, like everyone's in this point of like finding all these different places to give your work the publicity that it needs. And so I don't think anyone's going to perceive that in a negative tone. I think everyone's going to be like understandable, like that makes sense. Yeah. So somebody said, doing it smart, could you be more precise?
So I think that's directed at my last comment. So you have, I think, we just pointed out maybe some of the fractures with Etsy, right? I think doing it smart is, where do you envision your work, whether it's physically or whether it's just branding. I think realizing where you position your work, maybe it's not Etsy. Maybe you pay for, some sort of account with Artsy, which won't charge you commission at the time of sale, but it gives you exposure within the art market, right? So I think positioning your work in the strongest platforms is what I mean by being smart. I think that there's a huge difference in getting multiple booths throughout the year at a craft fair, which is not bad if that's where you want to be. But if you're trying to sort of position yourself in the art world or the white cube world with the galleries, then you have to make changes, because there's an economy that happens on the side of the Etsy and the crafts. And, you can certainly find anything on eBay these days, but is that the exposure that you want for your work? So it's either about the economy or about the branding that you're pushing for your work.
So I'm going to take the last couple of questions here. So I think Jen is asking, essentially, would a buyer be scared off by like being presented with a contract? And I think that's more so because when you're a self-represented artist and you don't have a gallery, you want to still have some protection for yourself. I would say if a buyer is scared of a contract, it's in some ways you should be concerned that the buyer might not be willing to fulfill the contract. But I think that in general, when you're working directly with an artist, I think they assume it's going to be like just like swipe a credit card style. But an artist does have to have contracts or things in place if it helps them protect themselves. If it's a direct sale of like one piece, maybe a contract isn't necessary, but definitely in the case of commissions directly to a collector, having a contract just makes sure that, you can tell them the timeline to get the thing done or whatever. And they can have an expectation of when to get their work, and you can have an expectation of, when you'll get your deposit. You can also have a kill fee if they decide they don't want to purchase the work anymore, or if they decide they don't want the commission anymore. You can say, okay, then that means that I keep the deposit because you're canceling, not me. Like you can have those things outlined for yourself. But I don't think a contract should be scary. I think in the case of like a sale, the contract maybe can be more simple. Doesn't have to be like 18 pages.
Just
an email is a contract as well.
Yeah, we all generate invoices all day when we have, when we have sales at the gallery. I don't issue contracts, but I do issue an invoice. And in that invoice, I think the important things are, of course, the term of payment, but then also if there's a credit associated with the work. Remember, once your work leaves your hand, it's going into a new life. So you want to at least give the collector, if it's a collector, the opportunity to mark that work, like you're giving them a provenance, you're giving them a credit for the image that they may want to share on whatever platform. These things make your work stronger. There's provenance. Where has the work shown? And in that same sense, once the collector acquires your work, the artist has a responsibility to provide a certificate of authenticity. So there's this exchange of not only the artwork for money, but then what really gives the value to the artwork is that provenance and also the certificate of authenticity. We're allowed to hold on to artworks only for as long as we're on this earth, right? So you want to make sure that your work has a legacy that follows it. So you want to give a certificate of authenticity that's signed by you, with proper proof that that is in fact a work by you. So I think it extends. An email would work fine, but then there's certain steps that should be followed by both parties just to build the legacy of that work.
And I think also in the case that you might be, maybe you're selling, maybe you don't have representation, but a museum approaches you to buy your work for their collection. I think in general, they would want to have a contract so they wouldn't be scared of it, but there's things to think about talking about legacy. What happens now? Again, this kind of ownership is changing hands. So what if, I guess you, Jen, in the case of your practice, so what if the work fades over time because of exposure to light? What are the parameters of what the museum should do? Will they be allowed to touch it up with dye? Or, like these kinds of conversations about how this work will live on or not are important to have if the work is being taken into an institutional sense, but also helpful, if maybe you're a photographer and you want to advise the collector, like, maybe don't put this in direct sunlight. That kind of thing.
Also really good, something I've been running to often is now with, social media or even television production, where you have instances where these producers or the event organizers, for example, we've been contacted by Lyft to do an art thing during Art Basel. These are the moments where if you get approached by any corporate sponsor or by any production company, the moment you release your work, the moment you release that image, if you didn't set parameters to protect yourself from, having the image replicated or used on a t-shirt or slapped on vinyl in a car, if you don't set those measures before you release that work, there's really nothing you can do to take it back. I mean, we're working nowadays with technology. It's so easy to Google and get anything you want. But when you're working with these bigger brands, make sure that you, in fact, not only receive a contract, but that you issue your own, because the likeness that they will reuse your image for whatever fundraising vehicle or whatever promotion, they're going to use it if you don't tell them they can't. And I've seen it with huge companies that are like, once we pay you the $500, we can do anything we want with this photo. We can print it out on paper to scale and put it in one of our television shows, and you can't say anything. So that is something to be really, really be aware of.
Yeah. And I think that's really the last question. And I think Carol just was saying thank you here for answering her question. So yeah, I think that, I think about this particular case I saw, which it's interesting because like I'm an adult on TikTok now, and I have a lot of artists that I see, and they're talking about like the field and practice, and they're a little younger than me most of the time, usually fresh out of college. And there was a conversation going around about this opportunity that Billie Eilish put out for artists to submit drawings for a project. And when you submit a lot of those projects for those things, even if you don't win, they own your work forever, right? And so in 4 years, you might not have gotten anything out of that, but in 4 years, they might be like, oh, remember that one drawing we had? We should put that on a shirt for this year's tour. And you have no power over that. So just like, and those contracts are purposely like 4-point font and tiny and like at the very end of the process. But reading through those things and deciding, not to tell you not to do it, but deciding if you're comfortable with that, right? Everyone has the limit, and if it's a drawing that takes you 5 minutes, then maybe you're like, who cares, but if it's something that takes you a lot of time, you obviously don't want to just put that into the ether without your control. So yeah. This was a very lovely conversation. I realized I was like, we probably won't even go that long, but we still ended up going to 12:30. I'm really grateful to both of you for joining me today. This was a really lovely conversation. Thank you to all the artists who attended virtually. And if you missed something, you want to see it again, we will be archiving this on our YouTube channel as well. And if you have any questions for any of us, please feel free to email me. You have access to my email. You should have gotten an email from me this morning. So thank you guys so much. And thank you so much to Yvette and Leilani for joining me.
And thanks to
really nice.
Joined. Thank you guys. Bye.
Take care,
bye, everyone. Bye. Bye, everyone.